The night of July 3rd, 1793 did not begin with a scream. It began with the oppressive, suffocating silence that hangs over a prison when the lights go out. In the medieval tower of the Temple Prison, a fortress built to hold knights, but now holding a broken family, the air was thick with the summer heat of Paris. Inside a third-floor room, a woman lay awake. She was 37 years old, but her face was etched with the lines of a woman of 60. Her hair, once the envy of every court in Europe, was streaked with gray and white. This was Marie Antoinette, the widow capped, the most hated woman in France. Beside her, breathing the soft, rhythmic breath of childhood, slept her 8-year-old son, Louis Charles. One hand rested protectively on his small chest, a reflex born of 6 months of terror. Since the execution of her husband, King Louis XVI, this boy was not just her son, he was her reason for existing. He was the uncrowned king of France, and she knew the wolves were circling. The silence shattered at 10 p. It wasn't a knock. It was an invasion. Heavy boots stomped up the stone spiral staircase, the sound vibrating through the floorboards. The door to the apartment exploded open. 6 men stood there, their silhouettes framed by the flickering light of lanterns. They were municipal guards smelling of cheap wine and revolutionary zeal. Their leader stepped forward, unfolding a piece of paper with the wax seal of the Committee of Public Safety. He didn't offer a bow. He didn't offer a greeting. He simply read the decree, the son of captives, to be separated from his mother and placed in the care of a tutor designated by the Republic. The words hung in the air like smoke. They hadn't come to kill her. They had come to do something far worse. They had come to amputate her heart. What followed was not a royal negotiation. It was a primal brawl. Marie Antoinette sprang from the bed, placing her body between the men and the sleeping child. When they stepped forward, she didn't argue with the logic of a queen. She fought with the ferocity of a cornered animal. For a full hour, the room was filled with the sounds of a desperate struggle, the screams of the mother, the terrified sobbing of the boy who had woken up to monsters, the shouts of the guards. She clung to the bedpost, she clung to the child, she threatened to kill him herself rather than let them take him. It was only when the guards threatened to kill her daughter Marie the RC, who was watching in horror from the corner, that her resistance broke. She dressed her son with trembling hands, weeping silently. She surrendered him, and as the heavy oak door slammed shut, separating them forever, Marie Antoinette collapsed. The psychological dismantling of the Queen of France had begun. This documentary will take you into the claustrophobic nightmare of Marie Antoinette's final 76 days. We will not just look at the famous execution. We will examine the systematic torture that preceded it. We will step inside the room where an 8-year-old boy was brainwashed into a monster. We will descend into the damp, rat-infested cell of the conciergerie, where a queen was reduced to a bleeding, broken object of surveillance. We will stand in the courtroom where the ultimate taboo was weaponized to destroy a mother's reputation. This is not the story of a political revolution. It is a forensic examination of a calculated act of soul murder. This is the story of medieval spirits. To understand the depth of Marie Antoinette's suffering, we must look at what happened to the boy. When the guards dragged Louis Charles down the stairs that night, they didn't take him to a school. They took him to an apartment just 1 floor below his mother's. He was close enough that she could sometimes hear his voice through the floorboards, a torture in itself. He was placed in the care of Antoine Simon, a cobbler by trade and a fanatical Jacobin by conviction. Simon was not a tutor. He was a breaker of spirits. His instructions from the committee were vague but understood. We do not want him killed. We do not want him poisoned. We want him to be rid of the idea of his rank. Simon interpreted this as a license to destroy the child's identity. The re-education of Louis Charles was a process of systematic abuse designed to erase the memory of his mother. The boy was locked in a dark room with barred windows. He was forced to wear the bonnet rouge, the red cap of the revolution. Simon and his wife forced alcohol down the throat of the 8-year-old until he passed out laughing as he stumbled and slurred his speech. When he cried for his mother, he was beaten. When he refused to sing revolutionary songs that called for the death of aristocrats, he was starved. It was a brutal regime of conditioning. Simon taught him the language of the gutter, rewarding him when he cursed the name of God or the king. The boy, terrified and desperate for approval from the only adult figure left in his life, began to mimic his captor. But physical abuse was only the beginning. The revolutionaries needed the boy to be a weapon against his mother. They began to feed him lies. They told him his mother hated him. They told him she had abandoned him. Slowly, systematically, they twisted his memory. They introduced the idea that his mother and his aunt, Madame Elizabeth, had engaged in unnatural acts with him. It is hard for the modern mind to comprehend the depravity of this. Grown men, prosecutors, and officials sat with a traumatized, drunk 8-year-old child and coached him to confess to incest. They manipulated his confusion, twisted his innocent words, and crafted a deposition of pure evil. They weren't just killing the boy's soul. They were forging a dagger that they would plunge into Marie Antoinette's heart in open court. And all the while, just one floor above the mother paced her cell, straining to hear the voice of the son she was accused of corrupting. By August, the revolutionaries decided that the temple was too comfortable, too remote. If Marie Antoinette was to be the centerpiece of the terror, she needed to be in the belly of the beast. In the dead of night on August 1st, guards woke her again. She was given minutes to pack a small bundle of clothes. She was not allowed to say goodbye to her daughter or her sister-in-law. She was marched out of the temple, the only home she had known for a year, and thrown into a carriage. The destination was the Conciergerie, a sprawling medieval complex on the Quai de la Cité known as the Antechamber of Death. The cell they threw her into was a study in misery. It was located on the ground level, half submerged, relative to the river scene outside. The walls sweated moisture constantly. The brick floor was slick with mud and slime. The air was thick with the smell of the river, the unwashed bodies of thousands of prisoners, and the rotting straw of the mattress. It was a place where light went to die. She was stripped of her name. From this moment on, the official records referred to her only as Prisoner 280. The Queen of France had become a number in a ledger, but the physical conditions were secondary to the surveillance. In the corner of her tiny cell, separated only by a flimsy folding screen, 2 gendarmes were stationed 24 hours a day. They smoked pipes, filling the small space with choking fumes. They drank, played cards, and stared. There was no privacy, not for a moment. Every bite of food she took, every prayer she whispered, every time she used the chamber pot, it was all done under the leering gaze of 2 men who hated her. This was the panopticon of the terror. It was designed to degrade her, to strip away the regal mystique, and leave only a frightened, exposed woman. Yet the guards noted with frustration that she maintained a haughty air. She fashioned a routine out of nothing. She cleaned her simple black dress. She read the few books she was allowed. She stared at a watch she had managed to keep counting the hours until a death she knew was coming. The stress of this environment began to manifest physically in horrific ways. Marie Antoinette was 37, but her body was failing. She began to suffer from frequent violent hemorrhaging. Historians suspect she had advanced uterine cancer or perhaps fibroids exacerbated by extreme stress. In the damp cold of the conciergerie, without proper hygiene or medical care, this became a daily torture. She had only a few chemises and rags to manage the bleeding. She had to wash them herself in a small basin of cold water, scrubbing out the blood while the guards watched. Then she had to hang them on a string in the stagnant air of the cell to dry. It was a humiliating, visceral reminder of her mortality. Her famous hair, once the subject of elaborate poofs that reached for the ceiling of Versailles, had turned stark bone white. This phenomenon, rapid graying due to extreme shock or stress, is now medically known as canietis subita, but it is often called Marie Antoinette syndrome because of her. She lost weight rapidly, her frame becoming skeletal. Her eyes, always her most striking feature, sank deep into her skull, rimmed with red from crying and lack of sleep. She suffered from convulsions and fainting spells. The dampness seeped into her bones, causing rheumatism that made every movement an agony. Yet despite the physical disintegration, her mind remained sharp. The revolutionaries hoped that the harsh conditions would break her, that she would become catatonic or insane, making her easy to convict. They wanted a gibbering wreck. Instead, they found a woman who was galvanized by suffering. She knew they were going to kill her. That certainty gave her a strange, icy freedom. She wasn't fighting for her life anymore. She was fighting for her dignity and the memory of her children. Every time she stood up straight despite the pain, every time she answered the guards with polite, cold courtesy, it was an act of rebellion. She was proving that while they could imprison her body, they could not colonize her spirit. On October 14, 1793, the final act began. Marie Antoinette was led from her cell to the Revolutionary Tribunal. This was not a court of law. It was a political theater scripted for a mob. The courtroom was packed to the rafters. The Tricodiuses, the market women who knitted while watching executions, sat in the front rows hungry for blood. The air was hot and smelled of sweat and unwashed wool. At the prosecutor's bench sat Antoine Fouquier Tinville, a man with the soul of a bureaucrat and the job of a butcher. He looked at the woman in the dock, pale, emaciated, dressed in a patched black mourning dress. He saw not a human being, but a symbol to be smashed. For 2 days, Fouquier Tinville barraged her with accusations. He accused her of sending French gold to Austria. He accused her of orchestrating the massacre of the Swiss guards. He accused her of plotting to blow up the National Assembly. Marie Antoinette answered each charge with a calm, logical precision that unnerved the court. She didn't shout. She didn't beg. She simply stated facts. I was a queen and you took away my crown, a wife and you killed my husband, a mother and you deprived me of my children. My blood remains, take it, but do not make me suffer long. Her composure was winning the room. The spectators who had come to see a monster were seeing a woman defending herself with immense dignity. Sensing he was losing the narrative, Fouquier Tinville played his trump card. He called Jacques H. Bert to the stand. H. Bert, a radical journalist who ran the filthy rag Le Pays Duchesne, stepped forward with a smirk. He unfolded the deposition they had tortured out of 8-year-old Louis Charles. In a loud theatrical voice, he read the accusation that Marie Antoinette had taught her son to masturbate and had forced him to commit incest with her. The silence that followed was absolute. It was a charge so vile, so obviously fabricated that it sucked the oxygen out of the room. The men on the jury looked away. The women in the gallery stopped knitting. It was a bridge too far even for the terror. Marie Antoinette sat motionless. The prosecutor goaded her, asking why she didn't answer the charge. She rose slowly from her chair. Her hands were clenching the rail of the dock so hard her knuckles were white. She looked past the judges, past the jury, directly into the faces of the market women in the crowd. Her voice cracked and raw rang out like a bell. If I have not answered, it is because nature itself refuses to answer such a charge laid against a mother. She paused, her eyes wet with tears. I appeal to all mothers who are present here. It was an electric current. The women in the crowd, the same women who had screamed for her head, suddenly saw themselves in her. They wept. They shouted in her defense. For a fleeting moment, the Queen of France turned the mob against the revolution. The verdict, of course, was never in doubt. At 4 a.m. on October 16th, the jury delivered the guilty verdict on all counts. The sentence was death. Marie Antoinette was taken back to the conciergerie. She had only hours to live. In the flickering light of a tallow candle, she sat down to write her final testament. It was a letter addressed to her sister-in-law, Madame Elizabeth. This document is one of the most profound artifacts of the human spirit. It is not the writing of a traitor or a monster. It is the writing of a woman at peace. "It is to you, sister, that I write for the last time," she began. Her handwriting was steady despite the exhaustion. She expressed no anger, no thirst for vengeance. She forgave her enemies. "I pardon my enemies, the evils that they have done me." She worried about her children, begging them not to seek revenge for her death. She wrote of her faith, her conscience clear. "I am calm as people are, whose conscience is clear." She poured her soul onto the paper, sealing it with a kiss. She folded it, wrote the name of Madame Elizabeth on the front, and handed it to the guard vault. She trusted that common decency would ensure its delivery. She was wrong. Balt, terrified of being accused of royalist sympathies, handed the letter to Fouquier Tinville. The prosecutor glanced at it, tossed it into a drawer, and forgot about it. Madame Elizabeth would never read it. She would follow the Queen to the guillotine months later, never knowing her sister's final thoughts. Marie the RC, the daughter, would survive the revolution, but she would spend decades wondering what her mother's last words had been. The letter lay gathering dust in the archives of the state for 20 years before it was rediscovered. It was a final act of cruelty, stealing a dying mother's goodbye. Dawn broke over Paris, cold and gray. At 7 a.m., the executioner arrived. His name was Henry Sanson, the son of the man who had beheaded the king. He was a professional, a man of few words. He asked her to turn around. With a large pair of shears, he hacked off her white hair. It fell in piles on the stone floor, the last vestige of the woman who had once set the fashion for the world. Marie Antoinette sat silently, her head bowed, submitting to the shearling like a sheep. Then he bound her hands behind her back. He tied the rope so tightly that she gasped, the rough hemp cutting into her swollen wrists. When the king was led to execution, his hands were tied only at the scaffold. For the Queen, the humiliation had to start early. She was led out into the Cour du Mail. She expected a carriage, the closed, dignified transport her husband had been granted. Instead, she saw a tumbril. It was a dirty, open cart normally used to haul manure or logs. A plank of wood served as a seat. There was no roof, no sides to hide her. She was to be paraded like a captured beast. She climbed in her balance, precarious, with her hands tied. The priest assigned to her, a constitutional priest who had sworn loyalty to the Republic, tried to climb in with her. She ignored him. She would not confess to a man who had betrayed her God. The journey to the Place de la Révolution was a 3-mile gauntlet of hate. 30,000 troops lined the streets. Behind them, hundreds of thousands of Parisians. They climbed onto rooftops, hung from windows, and surged against the barricades. The noise was deafening, a roaring ocean of Vive la République and death to the Austrian. They threw dirt-rotten vegetables and spit at the cart. Marie Antoinette sat rigid. She did not look at them. She stared fixedly at the rooftops, her eyes focused on something far beyond the city of Paris. She refused to give them the satisfaction of a single tear. In a window above the Rue Saint-Honore, the artist Jacques-Louis David sketched her as she passed. The drawing captures the moment perfectly, the jutting Habsburg jaw set in defiance, the eyes closed in disdain, the posture of a queen who reigns even in chains. The cart rattled into the Place de la Révolution, the vast square where the guillotine stood tall against the sky. The blade glinted high above the crowd. The scaffold was slippery with the blood of those executed before her. Marie Antoinette stepped down from the cart. Her legs were weak from months of confinement and the loss of blood, but she did not stumble. She climbed the steep wooden steps with a steady rhythm. 1, 2, 3. She reached the platform. The executioner and his assistants moved to grab her to strap her to the plank. But in the confusion of the moment, she made a small human error. She stepped on Henry Sanson's foot. It was a clumsy, awkward moment. She stopped. She looked down at the executioner's boot, then up into his eyes. And she spoke her final words. Not a curse on France. Not a plea for mercy. She said, "Pardon me, sir. I did not mean to do it. It was an apology to the man who was about to cut off her head." In that split second, the entire narrative of the revolution collapsed. They had painted her as a monster, a harpy, a beast. But monsters do not apologize for stepping on toes. Beasts do not show courtesy to their killers. In her final breath, she proved herself more civilized than the society that was murdering her. They strapped her to the plank. The lunette, the wooden collar, clamped down around her neck. At 12:15 p.m. The blade fell. The executioner lifted her head by the roughly shorn hair, showing it to the silent, stunned crowd. They had killed the woman, but they had failed to kill the legend. The 76 days of torture, the brainwashing of her son, the public humiliation, it was all designed to erase her. Instead, it canonized her. The revolution, like Saturn, had devoured its own children, but in its attempt to digest Marie Antoinette, it choked. She remains 2 centuries later, the ultimate tragic figure, a reminder that dignity is the one thing a tyrant can never confiscate. This is Medieval Spirits. We dig up the bones of history to find the truth buried beneath the lies. If this story moved you, subscribe and join us as we uncover the past.